Okay, welcome everyone. So since this event is part of the Nature of Writing series in partnership with the North Cascades Institute, I would like to invite Kim Nelson to say a few words. Kim is the Marketing and Executive Assistant for North Cascades Institute. So welcome, Kim.
Hi, thank you for having me. Before I get started, I want to first acknowledge the Coast Salish people who have stewarded the land where I'm standing since time immemorial. Since I am in Anacortes, I want to personally acknowledge the Swinomish Indian tribal community, as well as the Samish Indian Nation. I offer this acknowledgement as a first step in honoring their relationship with the land that we share, as well as a call towards further learning and action in support of our Indigenous neighbors. Thank you. As Claire mentioned, I am here tonight representing North Cascades Institute. I imagine that all of you are already familiar with our organization, but just in case you aren't, we are a conservation nonprofit, and our mission is to inspire environmental stewardship through transformative learning experiences in nature. Accordingly, we offer programs for people of all ages and backgrounds to explore and engage with nature in the hopes that they'll one day go on to protect these wild and sacred places. North Cascades Institute offers many different programs, including Mountain School, a 3-day overnight environmental education experience for 5th grade students. And we are also currently recruiting students for our Youth Leadership Adventures program, which involves multi-day backcountry trips for high school students, focusing on climate change solutions and building leadership skills. Additionally, we offer a diverse suite of adult and family programs, which includes field excursions, family camps, art and writing retreats, online classes, and even boat tours. Most of our programs typically take place on the North Cascades Environmental Learning Center on the beautiful wooded shoreline of Diablo Lake in the heart of North Cascades National Park. We just recently reopened our facility to the public, so if you haven't been before, or if it's been a while, now is the perfect time to plan a visit. I want to also take a moment to give a big plug for our upcoming online classes and field excursions. We'll be covering topics such as nature photography, plants, birds, painting, geology, history, lichens, wildlife tracking, and there's many more classes that will be announced soon. You can find out all about these programs by visiting our website at ncascades.org. That's the letter N as in northcascades.org. And you can also be the first to find out about our upcoming programs and events by signing up for our online newsletter. And I'll be sure to drop those links in the chat momentarily. So I am so excited for tonight's lineup of speakers. We have 3 very unique voices who have all found their calling in the North Cascades. Each one of these speakers has spent many years exploring, interpreting, protecting, and sharing their love of this area. They have each published books on the topic, as well as taught countless students. Additionally, they have all been instrumental in developing the North Cascades Institute into the nationally recognized organization that it is today. I want to first introduce William Dietrich. William, who also goes by Bill, is a retired Seattle Times journalist who won the Pulitzer Prize in 1990 for covering the Exxon Valdez oil spill. He is the author of 22 books, both nonfiction and fiction, including Final Forest, Napoleon's Pyramids, and the North Cascades, Finding Beauty and Renewal in the Wild Nearby, which I love. Bill taught environmental journalism at Huxley College of the Environment and served on the Institute's board of directors during the development of the North Cascades Environmental Learning Center. Welcome, Bill.
Thank you. Hey, thanks for everyone for coming. I want to say that I was over the North Cascades Highway on Monday and Tuesday. It is spectacular right now. So if you get a good day, it's really nice. And the wildflowers on the east side are extraordinary. So I'm going to read, to start things off, just briefly from this book again. There it is, North Cascades. This was a group effort that the Mountaineers Press organized. Christian Martin, our MC tonight, was also a major contributor. And so what I'll do is I'll read a little bit from the beginning of the book, and we'll use that to kick things off. So this is about the North Cascades. The North Cascades are surrounded by 7 million people, crisscrossed by jetliners and threaded by highways. Their retreating glaciers have become a barometer of climate change. At the same time, grizzly, wolf, wolverine, and eagle, once shot and trapped, are coming back. There is a new environmental learning center across Diablo Dam and new philosophies about forest fires, ecosystem management, and outdoor recreation. There is the reality of the mountains, that difficult terrain that is racked by evolving change. It's incredibly wild, said Chip Jenkins, a former North Cascades National Park superintendent. It is raw. It is physically and psychologically demanding. And there is the ideal of the mountains, a place frozen into a calendar photo. The North Cascades are besieged and yet sacrosanct. They are eternal, and yet their purpose is constantly being reinvented in our minds. Tucked into the fourth corner of the United States, these mountains were the last to be explored. They are still remote, jungle dense on their western slopes, and relatively unknown. Fjord narrow lakes wind into the mountain fastness. It is a 55-mile boat trip from Chelan to the mountain hamlet of Stehekin. The North Cascades Highway, opened in 1972, brings 750,000 people through a corridor between the two halves of that park each summer season. But only 26,000 walk far enough from their cars to enter the park proper. The park is also truncated. Because of political compromise, Mount Baker is outside the national park complex, which technically includes the parklands and adjacent natural recreation areas. So is the other glaciated volcano in the range, Glacier Peak. There is a bewildering patchwork of land designations, a contentiously debated road network, and a consortium of agencies. Which brings us to peril. Visionaries protected this range over many decades of political battle in the 20th century. What one sees today from the summit of Mount Baker, such as craggy Mount Shekson, the fanged Picket Range, the ice cream mound of Glacier, now needs a new generation of stewardship. How shall we manage these crags? Can their complex succession of ecosystems be sustained? Will salmon survive in the rivers? Will grizzlies, wolves, and wolverines roam? How can the North Cascades be resilient in the face of climate change? Can an alpine environment thrive if adjacent lowlands are paved over? Can we help native plants and organisms resist invasive species? How can a growing and aging urban population visit this landscape without overpowering it? What does wilderness mean when it abuts a megalopolis of thickening development that stretches from Vancouver, British Columbia to Eugene, Oregon? Well, in a frenzied world, the North Cascades are a refuge of calm. In a warming world, they are a remnant of the Ice Age. In a homogeneous world, they remain exotic. In a crowded world, they are empty, and they are best befriended by foot. So I'm going to stop there and turn it back to Kim, and you're going to hear from the other authors as well as we go along.
Thank you so much for setting the scene for us, Bill. Let's bring in our other speakers for tonight. So next we have John Miles. John has taught at Huxley College for over 40 years, including serving as dean. He has published many books, including this one here, Impressions of the North Cascades, Essays of the Northwest Landscape, which also happens to be one of Village Books' staff picks. John was the Institute's founding board chair, and he worked on many different important projects for the Institute, including helping develop the North Cascades Environmental Learning Center, as well as helping create the graduate program. And then next, we of course have Saul Weisberg. Saul is the executive director and co-founder of the North Cascades Institute. He is an ecologist, naturalist, and writer who has authored several books, including North Cascades, The Story Behind the Scenery, Teaching for Wilderness, and this book here, Headwaters, Poems and Field Notes, another one of my favorites. And just in case you haven't heard by now, but I'm sure you have, Saul is retiring at the end of June after 35 years at the helm of the Institute. When asked what he is looking forward to most in his much-deserved retirement, Saul simply replied, more poetry, less administration. Saul, John, and Bill are joined tonight by the Institute's very own Christian Martin. Christian is an environmental and travel writer who has been featured in regional newspapers and magazines, as well as contributed towards books about the North Cascades, Tom Robbins, and travels in Scandinavia. He has served as the Institute's marketing and communications manager for 15 years. So without further ado, please welcome Saul, Bill, John, and Christian. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Kim. That was excellent introduction to this wonderful collection of North Cascadian writers and teachers and conservationists. And I want to jump right in to this conversation, having the three of you together. And thank you, Bill, for setting the scene of where the North Cascades are and what they represent and how rugged they are. There's a lot of people on the Zoom call from across the country, so I think you did a great job of adding some flavor of the place that we're talking about tonight. And now I want to jump into your personal stories. I want to hear from each of you what, if you're not from here, or even if you are, you know, what brought you to the Pacific Northwest, but also what was it about the North Cascades that called out to you? We're going to be talking about your long relationships in writing and education and conservation in the North Cascades, but where did this story all start for each of you? And I'm going to first ask Bill, again, what is your connection to the Pacific Northwest, and what was it about the North Cascades that called out to you? And you're muted, Bill, so go ahead and unmute yourself. There we go.
There. Yeah, I was born and raised in Tacoma, grew up camping, hunting, fishing, the usual Northwest thing. But we tended to do the southern half of the state because Dad didn't want to have to drive through Seattle if he could avoid it. And so I was unfamiliar with the North Cascades until I came up to school at Fairhaven College at Western. One of the classes I and my new wife took was a mountain climbing class, which took us out to the Cascades. We climbed the Twin Sisters, we climbed Mount Baker and so on. And of course I was blown away. And then as I was finishing college and starting my first newspaper job at the Bellingham Herald, the North Cascades Highway opened. And that turned what had been an incredibly sort of inaccessible mountain range into something you could all of a sudden drive across. And so that got me interested as well. And I've come back to it. You know, I moved around to different newspapers and stuff, but when we chose a long-term home, it was Anacortes. And having the mountain range in my backyard and being able to write about it periodically has just been magical.
And can you briefly touch on how your career has been intertwined with the North Cascades?
Well, I began writing politics as a journalist. And so when I eventually got into environmental writing, because it was a wonderful way to get out of the newsroom and go walk in the woods, I was interested in the human natural dynamic. I mean, that was really what I wrote about more than nature per se, at least initially. And the North Cascades were both contentious. For example, the Skagit River dams have always been in the news and so on. But they were also sort of the ultimate counterpoint to what was happening in the Puget Sound Basin or the extensive logging that was going on in the area. And so I just got pulled back into them as a subject matter again and again.
All right, thanks for sharing that little tidbit of your connection to North Cascades. I'm going to ask John the same thing. What brought you to the Pacific Northwest, and what's the story of your connection to this special mountain range and ecosystem?
Well, I grew up in New Hampshire. I couldn't be further from the North Cascades and still be in the United States, to tell you the truth. But there are some mountains in New Hampshire, and I came to love mountains from a very young age. And then I went to Dartmouth College in New Hampshire, and a bunch of my friends in the Dartmouth Alpine Club would go in the summers out to the North Cascades. And I had no idea where they were, what they were, but they would always come back and just extol the virtues of these wonderful peaks and glaciers and all of that sort of thing, which wasn't too common in New Hampshire. So when I was about to graduate from Dartmouth, David Brower came to the college to give a talk to my class, and he recruited me into the Sierra Club. He was traveling the country defending the Grand Canyon, but he was also leading a campaign, or at least part of a campaign, to establish a North Cascades National Park. So that was my introduction to that idea. Then I went to graduate school at the University of Oregon, and lo and behold, I find myself in the presence of David Brower again, and he says, "All right, John, you get to work. You got to get this park done." So that's how it all started. And then when I left Oregon, I got a job in Bellingham, Washington. And I came to Bellingham and started my work on August 15th, 1968. On October 2nd, 1968, President Johnson signed the North Cascades National Park bill. So the park came to be. And so I thought, wow, how did the heck, this must have been foreordained. But anyway, I went right out and I started hiking and climbing and did so for the next 20 years, really, until I started my association with the North Cascades Institute. And I came to really love the North Cascades. I couldn't believe all the amazing qualities of the place. And I gained a sense of place. Even though I was a New Englander to start with, it seemed like I developed a sense of place for the Northwest in general, but the North Cascades in particular right away. So when John Reynolds called one day and said, "John, would you be interested in participating in this organization that we're trying to create here? A couple of my rangers are trying to put this organization together to educate in and about the North Cascades." I thought, wow, what a great idea. I wish I'd thought of that. Sign me up. And that's how I became part of the North Cascades Institute family.
All right, so I'm hearing a connective tissue in this story of mountaineering is for both of you. Getting up with your ice axes and crampons and hiking boots sounds like was a first step for both of you. And I got a feeling that might be the same for Saul as well. Saul, I want to ask you the same. How did you come to the Pacific Northwest? What's your origin story? And then what was it about the North Cascades that really grabbed your soul and made you stay here?
Thank you, Christian. This is really fun to see this conversation starting. We've had this before, but not for a long, long time. I was born on the Lower East Side of New York, Lower East Side of Manhattan, and moved to Cleveland when I was 4. And I didn't know mountains, but somehow I had parents who helped me fall in love with the outdoors and with nature and national parks. And every summer we would take off for a 5 or 6 week, usually probably 5-week camping trip somewhere. And we didn't go from park to park to park. We went to one place and set up shop for a month and hiked and played. And my brother and I were just told to go out and explore, which we did. And I was always drawn to mountains. And I think that was especially true probably when I was about 10 years old. We did a trip out to the Grand Tetons. And I remember going on a 17-mile day hike with my dad up to Lake Solitude, and very few people up there. We saw very few people. I don't remember now that it was exhausting, but I've heard stories that it was not a gentle hike. But I went to Antioch College in Southern Ohio, and my last year there, I came out, got a job on a salmon trawler off the Washington, Oregon coasts. And I'd already been climbing limestone cliffs back in Ohio and at the Shwangunks in New York. And actually started climbing in the Tetons after graduating from college. But being on a salmon trawler, a 36 salmon trawler with one other person out for weeks at a time, looking at the Olympics just made me realize this is where I'm headed afterwards. And when that was when the fishing season was long and you could catch, 100 giant fish in a day sometimes, very different. And after that trip, with a friend some friends went and climbed Mount Olympus and knew I'd be back. And so finished up a few things in Antioch, moved out, and mostly started exploring the Olympics and Mount Rainier and climbing Mount Rainier, and really didn't know much about the North Cascades. But I knew I was in the right place. And then I was applying for jobs, and I actually had worked a lot of jobs just to stay out here, jobs in the woods, salmon hatchery, tree planting, fire lookout in the Southern Cascades down near the Columbia River. And I applied for a job with the Park Service, and I got a call from a guy named Bill Lester who said, "Hey, we got a backcountry ranger job at this place called at Cascade Pass. You know where that is, don't you?" And I was like, no idea. And so I found myself that June driving up to Marble Mount, and then a few days later hiking into Cascade Pass for my first probably 10-day patrol. And there's sort of no looking back at that point. It wasn't just the mountains, it was the rivers, it was the people, it was the wildlife, it was the learning wildflowers. It just sort of was like, okay. And so over the next years through graduate school, for 9 years, I came back to work in the North Cascades as a climbing ranger for most of that time in the park. And then towards the end of that, a group of friends and I had been scheming about how do we, one, find a job that we can all do together that's more play than work. And just seeing the need, especially at that time, of spotted owl and timber wars, that conservation was not a tool that was being used for education so much as other things. And it just seemed like an idea that we had no idea if it would work, but we seemed like we were ready to give it a try.
And how did you're starting to think about how to make a different career in the North Cascades and a conservation career instead of maybe moving from the Park Service or an agency backcountry ranger? How did you cross paths with these two? Or does that come a little bit later in the story?
Well, John, it came really early in the story. I was trained as a field biologist. My master's degree is in birds. And I thought that's where I was going until I started hanging out with, no offense to the academics in the audience, but I started hanging out with a lot of academics in the subject I was passionate about, seabirds. I remember going to a conference up at UBC in Vancouver. And these were the birds I'd been studying for 3 winters out on a small boat. And I just was dying to talk to people. And in 3 or 4 days of presentations by the people that I had been reading, there was only one presentation by Dennis Paulson from Seattle that showed a picture of a living bird. And I said, this is probably, there were pictures of graphs and charts and all that kind of stuff, but I just said, this is probably not for me. And I'd already been doing some teaching and I loved that. So my friend Tom Fleischner and I talked to the park super, a lot of stuff went on there, but at one point, the park superintendent, John Reynolds, who was very supportive of what we were doing, suggested we go talk to this guy he knew, the dean at Huxley College. And we had no idea who I'd gotten to school there, but I wasn't part of Huxley. That's where all the, that's where all the hippies hung out there in Fairhaven, Bill. So I was a true, biologist. And so Tom and I went to see John, and I'm not sure if we went to your office or we actually just met in town. You suggested we meet in town because we ended up, I think, buying some beer and going down to the Marine Park and sitting by the water.
Yep.
And just talking about this idea. And I think we expected a dean to ask us all these really challenging questions, but you were more excited than we were. And it just started. And we basically the whole period, that early period, Tom and I recruited people who were smarter than we were and knew stuff that we didn't know. and especially some people who were, you know, ran small businesses like Chuck Robinson and Village Books in Bellingham. And, you know, I won't say it didn't seem like work, but it certainly seemed enough like play to keep us going. And I remember somewhere in there, I wrote a letter to my parents back in Cleveland, which my mom still has. And it said, we started this thing called North Cascades Institute. I think it might be a good gig for a couple of summers. And
how many summers ago was that?
It was 35 summers ago. So maybe this is 36. I don't know. Anyway, it was people here in the Northwest were hungry for something like this. And we just had, it was, you know, it was kind of a perfect example of right place, right time. People cared about the environment. They were outdoor people, and getting outside to learn outside. I mean, what could be more fun than that?
Yeah, and one thing, Saul, you and I have talked about many times over the past 15 years I've been here at the Institute is the common denominator of the birth of the Institute was that you and Tom and the other founders were going for conservation. You wanted to protect this place. You loved this place and cared about the wildlife and the glaciers and conservationists at heart. And you saw this opportunity to use education, and that education was at the time in the early 80s, early to mid 80s, was just not a tool that you saw being used for conservation.
Well, you know, I think it's interesting. I mean, Bill, certainly with your writing, and John with all your work on forest issues, especially when you were dean, know that side of the story more than I did. What I saw was this place that I loved, and I was deep into natural history and the plants and animals and interactions of things. What I saw is people passionate about defending this place, and there, you know, there was litigation. Some people were doing litigation. Some people were purchasing land. Some people were spiking trees. I mean, the ancient forests were disappearing at an incredible rate then. And driving up the North Cascades Highway to Marble Mount, you would see, you know, it would be not unusual to see dozens and dozens of log trucks, and many of those trucks would have one single old growth log on it. So many trucks to bring one tree down the mountain. How long has it been since any of us have seen that? That was common in when I started working for the Park Service. That was 1979. And we started
John, do you have any recollections of these early gleamings, like that meeting with Saul and Tom, and why you encouraged them to pursue this idea and how you might have influenced it?
Well, I didn't know at the time that they'd been struggling for a number of years to connect with a university. I mean, one of the things they thought they needed in order to legitimize their enterprise was to have the ability to grant credit and all that kind of stuff, which only universities can do. So that might have been behind them in the mind of, say, John Reynolds or whomever initiated the contact to me as a dean of the Environmental Studies College at Western. I'm a conservationist, always have been a conservationist, and was at Huxley College, and that was, and my specialty really, I taught more environmental education classes at Huxley College than anything else, and right away I saw, hey, these guys have an idea about a way to do environmental education at that point for adults. Most of my focus was on kids and schools and all that kind of stuff. But adult environmental education was something we really needed to tackle because, of course, the North Cascades were being mowed down by the Forest Service during not the park, but everything else outside the park boundaries. And there were a lot of issues about the park. How was the park going to be developed? So I thought, wow, this is a perfect opportunity to pursue some of the goals of conserving this place and educating people, because what you need is a small army to get the work done. And that was what excited me about it.
Where do you enter this picture, Bill? John, I'm going to have you read from your recent research and book on NCI, but before we get to that, I wanted to ask Bill how you enter this storyline.
Well, I was a reporter at the Seattle Times and got to cover some of the major environmental issues, the XMLBs, the spotted owl, early research into the ozone hole and global warming and so on. But we weren't allowed to join anything as reporters. I mean, absolutely, they didn't even want us in the Rotary Club. We were to be hands-off. So my fiction writing, though, allowed me to break away as a full-time employee. It gave me more freedom. And so Saul invited me to join the board. And for me, it was something completely different than anything I'd done. And I remember coming up to New Halem and the camp they had there, this big old army tent, and these little kids with the rain sluicing down. You know, I thought, man, these are tough little kids to be out here learning about nature and so on. And this guy named Saul Weisberg, who I was meeting, had this grand vision of this incredible environmental learning center that he was going to build up on the lake, and you know, needed a board to help. And you know, my job basically was just to vote yes periodically, but it was just really great fun to see it come to fruition.
All right. Well, we've set a nice stage of the historical beginnings here, and that leads into a work that John's been working on, a research project or nonfiction book about, well, I haven't read it yet, so I can't explain it too well, but Teaching in the Rain, John, is that your latest project? Is a book about the origins of NCI and some lessons learned and things like that?
Well, I see it as the story of the North Cascades Institute's first 35 years. And it isn't a book yet, it's a manuscript. I've drafted the first draft of it at least. And so what I'd like to share is a couple of short passages from the first and second chapters. The first chapter.
Well, Bill and Saul and I are going to duck out for a minute and give you the stage and share your manuscript with us.
Okay, here you go. North Cascades Institute came to be because the right people were in the right place at the right time with a good idea, deep commitment to that idea, and determination to see it become reality. Saul Weisberg, Tom Fleischner, Ed Grumbine, Jeff Hardesty, and Tim Jordan thought the time was right to create a field school in the North Cascades mountain region. Their knowledge of this place was growing as they traveled and studied it as park rangers, biologists, and outdoor educators. As their delight in discoveries and adventures there grew, the idea of introducing and leading others to the place captured their imagination and offered an outlet for their youthful idealism. All were conservationists and educators, and they thought they might advance the conservation of this special mountain region through field-based learning. North Cascades was their inspiration, a wild, gloriously scenic concentration of mountains and glaciers, deep forested valleys, and falling waters. A large part of the range had recently been included in the North Cascades National Park. Other areas in the range had become parts of the National Wilderness Preservation System, as the Pasayten Wilderness, the Glacier Peak Wilderness, and the Alpine Lakes Wilderness. Only 2 highways crossed the range, while the southern boundary was marked by a very busy interstate highway. The group thought this place, literally the backyard of a rapidly growing urban region in the Puget Sound Basin, should be better known by the millions who could see it on their eastern horizon. They believed that caring for a place required knowing it, and pursuing opportunities to know it would help to conserve it. That's the core idea. While parts of the region were park and wilderness and thus protected to some degree, conservation was still needed. As the group bandied about the idea of a field school in the early 1980s, Ronald Reagan was president of the United States, and his administration was avowedly anti-conservation. Most of the North Cascades were federal public land under management of the National Park Service and the Forest Service. Timber harvest was rising to an all-time high on the national forests. James Watt was Secretary of the Interior, and no one was sure what might befall the National Park Service and exceptional landscapes in its domain like the North Cascades. Conservationists who had achieved so much in the region by protecting portions as national park and wilderness could not rest on their laurels. The 1970s had seen emergence of environmental education and renewed interest in outdoor education, an approach to teaching about the natural world that had been popular on and off since the 19th century. Environmental education embraced much of what outdoor education had been teaching for decades, but broadened it to include an ecological emphasis and emergent issues like pollution, population, the loss of biological diversity. Outdoor education had long embraced experiential methods of teaching and learning, moving outside the classroom to experience the environment and to learn as much about subjects ranging from reading to math as could be achieved there. Environmental education was doing the same, broadening the content to include, in the words of one historian of the period, working toward protecting the beauty, health, and permanence of nature in the 20th century. The field school envisioned by the Institute group would use the outdoor classroom to teach about the North Cascades environment, employing experiential methods to contribute to conservation. Now let me jump briefly to the second chapter, The Seeds Are Sown. 4 guys, jokingly called by themselves the Marble Mount Boys Club, gathered one summer day on the Lightning Creek Float, a ranger station on Ross Lake, complete with a cabin used by the National Park Service as it patrolled the Ross Lake National Recreation Area, part of the North Cascades National Park Complex. The 4 were Saul Weisberg, Tom Fleischner, Tim Jordan, and Jeff Hardesty. The year was 1981. Ed Grumbine wasn't there. He was working in California at the time. The Marble Mount Boys Club had been working on their dream for several years at this point. Their vision was that they would operate the Shuckson Institute, which they called it in the beginning, as a collective, and 4 or 5 of them would be the board, since the IRS said they had to have a board. They envisioned an organization with as little bureaucracy as possible, but at the same time intended to cater to adults and especially teachers who would get credit for their participation. They approached several institutions of higher education in hope of affiliating with them in some way so credit could be offered, but found no takers. Tom and Saul did much of the work fleshing out the plans for the Shuckson Institute, the other 3 occupied with other jobs. The biggest challenge was to find a way to get started, particularly to raise funds to cover initial expenses and very modest compensation, indeed, for their work. Saul returned to his climbing ranger job in the summer of 1985, where his boss was Wilderness District Ranger Bill Lester. Saul shared the idea for a field institute in the park with Bill and found him very supportive. The summer of 1985 also saw a change of leadership in the park when John Reynolds became the new superintendent. One day, Saul was waiting for a helicopter flight out of the Marble Mount base for a rescue, and new Superintendent Reynolds was there. As he prepared for his new job, Reynolds had come across a report containing the ideas 2 rangers had shared with Keith Miller, who had previously been superintendent. Reynolds asked Saul what had come of the idea, and the 2 agreed to talk about it soon. Bill Lester had also told Reynolds about the Field Institute some of his rangers aspired to create and encouraged him to consider it. Late in the season, Tom, Saul, Bill, and John met to discuss the idea, and John asked what it would take to make it happen. The meeting proved the breakthrough that resulted in establishment of the North Cascades Institute. What they needed was support from the Park Service and some resources with which to begin work. John and Bill said they would keep Tom and Saul on as backcountry rangers during the off season, and they could work on getting their program going for the summer of 1986. They could use National Park Service phones and any desk in park headquarters that might be open on a given day, complete with an IBM Selectric typewriter. With files in a plastic file box, thus began the Institute's traveling office period. Tom and Saul, as co-directors of the Institute, began conceiving classes, recruiting instructors, typing up a catalog, recruiting a founding board, and applying to the IRS for nonprofit 501c3 status. So that's kind of part of the story of how it all began, how they'd struggled for 4 years to figure out, and mostly at this point in the late stages of that, given up on the idea. And then John Reynolds and Bill Lester appeared on the scene, and the rest is history.
All right, that's wonderful, John. Thank you for sharing your storytelling there. And Saul and Bill, you want to come back on? I think because I have the 3 of you together, there's a lot of different nodes in the story of the Institute, the growth, the creation of mountain school for local elementary school children was a big step forward. And there was many different steps along the way, but because I have the 3 of you here, my sense is that you all served together when the idea of the Learning Center came around. Is that correct? And do you want to, can anyone speak to possibly that period in time when the three of you were collaborating with the rest of the board and staff to where did that idea come from? And it's a really unusual partnership that came together to create the Learning Center and the Ferc licensing and all that. So can anyone speak to a little bit of when the three of you were actively working together on the Learning Center?
Well, let me jump in briefly, and then I'll let Saul take over the story because he was the major player in the whole thing. But what I would say is, in the beginning, we thought this Ferc business was an opportunity to get a little money to support the field seminars that we were running at the time.
And can you briefly describe for the audience what is Ferc?
Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, because the dams on the river require licenses. And in the 1920s, when they first got their licenses, the Federal Power Commission was in charge, and they didn't give a darn about things like conservation and fish and so on. But by the time in the late 1980s, the City Light had to relicense those dams, the whole world had changed. And now they had to come up with some mitigation for the impacts on the environment of those dams. So we thought, though this had never been done anywhere before, that maybe education could be seen as mitigation of impact. So why not? What the heck? Let's go for it. We went down, we got the N3C to agree, because they were one of the interveners in the process, to agree
North Cascades Conservation Council.
North Cascades Conservation Council. And then the board, the NCI board, said, let's go for it. So Saul launched off and he made it happen.
Well, I would say that we had a lot of friends to make that happen. Certainly the North Cascades Conservation Council took us under their wing, and they were incredibly helpful because they, and the rest of the environmental community. But what was interesting is that over that period of difficult and challenging negotiations, and then difficult and challenging, design and construction. I mean, we got involved with this in 1988. So we were a baby organization. The Conservation Council put a lot of trust in us because they just thought it was that education was missing with all the other buildings and stuff. We weren't talking about a learning center then, we were just talking about providing education. And, but everybody, I mean, it was of all the things that people were fighting over, fish passage and erosion and, all the other pieces that required lots and lots of science and other things to do. I think that everyone, the Park Service was a huge ally, of course, the Forest Service, the 4 tribes that were involved, Department of Wildlife, this NOAA, all the different agencies and other NGOs, because who can't support young people getting outside to learn about these public lands that everybody around here loves? It's one of the few places where, the environmental community and the resource extraction community, they all wanted places like this for their kids to play and learn. And so there was really there was certainly difficult conversation about what this might look like, how much money would be involved, but there was very little at root. This idea was something that people believed in. And it was John Jarvis, who was the chief of natural resources for North Cascades National Park then, who realized that the Diablo Lake Resort, the old fishing camp that had been an old work site for the building of the dams, had gone belly up. It was sitting there with some leaking gas tanks underground and just dilapidated structures. And he said, wouldn't that be a good place for something that we had talked about years before that we thought might be in a different location in the park, near where the current visitor center is? And that just kind of, the pieces came together and it grew. We didn't start out negotiating and then start big and negotiate to some compromise. We started very small, and everybody at the table, including Seattle City Light, just kept thinking of how this could serve much larger needs. And we became the beneficiaries of a much larger partnership, because we would tell the story. Education tells the story of what's happening in the park and the forest and with the wildlife and the fish, and it's tribal stuff. You know, it all sort of comes together. And that's what had been missing in the past. It was all these different agencies and governments. And it was one of those right place, right time things, not much bigger and grander than any of us ever expected, much more time consuming and lengthy time to actually get it established, because it didn't open in, the licenses were signed in 89, 90,
91.
91. The Learning Center opened in 2005. So that period is a time warp when we were all working together. But if we had tried to build the Learning Center, and all of us, the city, the park, to build the Learning Center in 91 or 95, none of us would have done as good a job, because we learned together by running all the other programs as field programs. So when we actually were ready to build, as one person said to me, "You're not just a developer, you're a developer in a national park." We were able to create something that fit the park and working with the park to make that happen.
I'd like to jump in here too. Saul is modest to a fault sometimes. A different visionary who came up with this could easily have alienated everyone. And I came into the process at least a decade after John and Saul had started it. And so it was well along, but it was before the center had been built. But what it impressed me about Saul Weisberg and his approach was he was a sponge in terms of learning from other people, not just educating, but learning. And so on the board, for example, he was turning to the people with business expertise. How do you run a business? How do you run an organization like this? He was asking about communication. He was asking about, well, how do you talk to rich people? Because it's useful to talk to rich people sometime. And he would bring all this in. He would talk to Native Americans. He would talk to government bureaucrats. He would talk to naturalists who were just superb educators. I'm thinking of people like Bob Pyle and Libby Mills, and some of these people that were recruited early on. And so he became sort of this magnet of talent that really has gotten this thing to be the success it is today.
Nobody's ever called me a sponge before, but I kind of like it.
Thanks for that reflection, Bill, and for the story of the early seeds and genesis of the Environmental Learning Center. And John, I know you've been researching a lot about the Institute, and I've sent you a bunch of information that I could find from our archives for your manuscript. Can you zero in on some aspects that make the Institute unique? And the organization that Saul has helped build or been the executive director of for 35 years, what stands out in the Institute and the way we do our work or the programs that we offer that's unique or original?
Well, I made a quick list because I knew this question was coming. And here they are. There are 6 things that I identified. One,
perfect.
Ability, as Bill pointed out, to attract the best talent. Absolutely, from instructors to staff, best talent. Its mission is great, and it has stayed on the mission throughout its 35 years with opportunities to go off track, but it didn't go off track, it stayed on track. Its relationships, partnerships, and collaboration. If anything, just to substantiate what Bill was just saying, Saul is a master of creating partnerships and collaborations. That's a key. It has controlled its growth over its history. And of course, there was a huge change when the Learning Center came on. It could have thrown another organization in big trouble. But in this case, because it had that solid mission, it didn't. So it remains stable. Its stability has been remarkable. It has had a standard of excellence in everything. And I would say its communications is one of the places where I've seen this throughout. I mean, the catalogs we used to marvel at the beauty of the catalogs of the art and the literature that was in those catalogs. And lastly, I'd say it's the Learning Center itself. I mean, few organizations have the luxury of designing a learning center from the ground up and going out, as NCI was able to do, and ask a whole bunch of learning centers across the country, if you could start from scratch, what would you suggest we do? And they got a lot of good insights, and it didn't work out in every respect, but we're able to create a facility and a site, a campus that is just, there's nothing quite like it.
All right, thank you.
I'd love to add one thing to that, because, and that's, I think John's spot on, and it's nice to have someone, it's nice to have a historian kind of pull out the buckets and say, oh, this fits here. And I go, oh yeah, it does, good job. One of the things that was unique about that process, both about the whole relicensing process, which continued into the designing of the Learning Center, was that because of the tribal involvement, because of the involvement of the Upper Skagit Indian tribe, the Swinomish Indian tribal community, the Sauk Suiattle tribe, and the Inglekatma tribe in BC, it was all done by consensus. And so when we were designing the Learning Center, we had the parks, North Cascades National Park, Seattle City Light, and the Institute in the same room talking about every little thing. And so what we did is we had access to engineers and people who ran a billion-dollar operation in 3 dams. Well, not 3 dams, that's just the Skagit dams and powerhouse. They knew that kind of stuff. We had us as educators. We had the National Park Service who had all of their expertise. And so all those things came together, and we had to agree on everything. And so there's no question in my mind that what we ended up with was much, much better than any one of us would have done on their own, or we would have done together if it had come down to duking it out in the hallway sometimes. We really had to understand each other's operations and what mattered to the other organizations, why it mattered, and how we were going to try to get to this common goal of efficiently, effectively, frugally making this happen.
I'd like to add too that interestingly, this whole process is still going on. A few weeks ago, I was just as a tourist, I was driving up to Diablo Lake just to look around, and there were all these city light trucks along the side of the road. And so I stopped wondering what was going on. And what they were doing was releasing water down the gorge from Gorge Dam in this absolutely spectacular cascade to see if they could rewater that gorge and whether fish could live in it or not. And I thought it was cool that, that we're still kind of going back to this landscape and trying to rethink what we've done. And if any of the people watching this get power from Seattle City Light, some tiny portion of your light bill has gone to NCI and gone to experiments like this. And so I always kind of feel it's sort of this communal effort that's going on.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for all those reflections. And this is a topic we could talk for hours and hours about, whether the audience would stick with us or not. There's a lot involved with the partnerships, the building of the Learning Center. It'd be great to talk about the moving from adult education, expanding into mountain school, and then the youth leadership adventures. All these are really rich topics, but we do have a time limit here. And I'm gonna ask kind of a wrap-up question, and then we'll move into some Q&A from the audience. If anyone out there has questions for either of these three, please drop it into the Q&A, and I'll start checking those out and asking. But a good place to end is we've talked about origins of the Institute, origins of the Learning Center, how an idea grew into a reality in a physical place, and a nonprofit organization that on average has 60 plus employees and multiple sites. It's really astounding hearing about the shared desks and the shared telephones. And Saul and Tom making it happen back then with John's support and the different agencies to where we are now, which is just astounding. And with that said, moving from kind of the historical view and looking back at where this all came from, I wanted to ask each of you if you have thoughts about the future of the North Cascades ecosystem, or environmental issues in the Pacific Northwest in general, and how education or engaging youth, young people and students is a way to meet those challenges. I know that's a really broad-based question, but what might be next in the story of both the Institute, but more importantly, the conservation of the North Cascades ecosystem and our beloved Cascadia?
Yeah, well, I'll go first. I think that the North Cascades is becoming a sort of an urban forest in a way that we could not have dreamed 20, 30 years ago because of growth in the Puget Sound Basin. I saw on Facebook, I don't know if this is true, but last summer during COVID, someone posted that there were 700 cars parked at Rainy Pass Trailhead, people trying to get into the woods. And I think there's going to be increasing uncomfortable talk about how accessible or inaccessible to make these mountains. You know, it's a very rare national park in that it is kind of difficult to penetrate, but more and more people are doing it all the time. It has the benefit that the weather is so bad that, you know, people are shut out for 6 months of the year, but even that's not true, because when you go up there in the wintertime, people are still penetrating the closed road and so on. And so, you know, does that mean, you know, permits? Does it mean more kind of deliberate education of people? You know, do you have to pass a test before you can go to the North Cascades or what? I don't know, but certainly the kind of Northwest that I and John and Saul grew up with isn't really here anymore. We got to figure out, you know, what the next stage is.
I think education is a part of that, and nonprofits assisting the agencies being helpful.
Absolutely. I think that has to happen. I think, number one, there are going to be permits. The Alpine Lakes Wilderness has been doing that for the last 25 years. And education is really the only alternative to regulation. If people don't know what they should and should not do, they'll just do whatever they feel like doing, and the consequences will be terrible. So I think education in many forms is the only alternative to severe regulation.
When I think about conservation in the 80s when we started, it would have been unbearably tragic to lose all those forests and all those trees and all those ecosystems. And a lot of that was protected. What we're looking at now with climate catastrophe is not magnitudes, doesn't sound big enough to compare. And so, I mean, that requires everyone, and it requires some education, certainly. That will require regulation, certainly. I heard there were 5,000 people this year that applied for a backcountry permit from the North Cascades, paid a $20 non-refundable deposit for that. And a certain number of those are not going to get the permits they wanted. And that was in March. I know some are left for, you know, a day of walk up people, but more and more people who have the time to plan time and money to plan vacations months and months in advance, and the transportation to get to a park with no public transportation access, really changes who gets to go more than it has in the past. And so I think that's really critical, and that makes the challenge that Bill raised of numbers even harder, because it's going to be it can be overcrowded just with a certain small segment of the population, and we need everyone to understand these places and experience them and vote to keep these things going. speaking about the parks, there really is one, I mean, education is one solution, or I would just say outdoor learning is one solution. But there's another solution, and that's to create more parks at the city, state, county, and federal level. I mean, we should be talking about tripling the size of the National Park Service, if possible, because 100 years from now, people will be thinking about those parks the way we're thinking about them right now. There's not enough public land. There's too many people. So somehow I don't have an answer to how we address that, although I'd say one of the ways the Institute is addressing this is we are really concerned with equity in access. And that means people have to know about these places, be able to get there, know how to recreate in ways that are responsible. I'm not talking about, things that are about personal choice. I'm just thinking about safe, basic, risk management. And that's a big deal. And it's going to require, once again, everybody at the table and a lot of work. And I feel, I'm at a point now where I want to get out there and spend more of my time out in the park than sitting behind the desk thinking about the park. But I really think that we need, the generations that are coming behind us that are here now, they need a chance to grapple with these things in ways that are not limited by the limits that we have because of the systems that we've come up in. And there's a lot of things that need to change. We don't know what they all are, but there is a tremendous sense of urgency and justice behind those changes. And at the same time, we still need people building and maintaining trails the right way and taking kids outside. And, we are still learning new ways to teach kids and new ways to reach more kinds of kids with different kinds of learning. So we need all of it, and we need to be all involved in it together.
Saul, what's the role of equity and expanding access to public lands and to wild lands for different populations and, expanding those circles out? What is the role of that work that I know NCI has been focused on for years? What is the role of expanding access in conservation? I mean, you kind of brushed up against it right there, but if I could ask you how that fits into, broader sense of national conservation movement and protecting places.
Well, I mean, if you're just talking about public lands in the US is changing. The demographics are changing. They have changed significantly since this park was established. I think it's fascinating that this park, Wilderness Act, civil rights, all came about in the mid 60s. I don't think that was just a coincidence. I think the country was looking for certain kinds of things to happen on a bunch of fronts, and they happened because a lot of people were engaged in things at the same time. But to be blunt, the outdoors and outdoor recreation, national parks can't be as white as they are now, 10 years from now, 20 years from now, because they won't have the supporters they need to survive. Mm-hmm. And so that means more people of all kinds finding them and loving them. And I don't know how, that's not an easy thing to do because there's many, many, many reasons for that, ranging from outright racism in some areas to just simple economics, which is not so simple in other areas, and distance and travel. But we've got to grapple with them in a serious way. And I know, many organizations are doing that now. Many agencies are doing that now. But this is really the beginning. I hope this is a new beginning of all that, but we don't know where that's going to go yet. And we are putting more energy into that than we ever have. Mm-hmm. And we have to learn. We're in a learning.
John or Bill, do you have any thoughts? Thank you, Saul. Do you have any thoughts about the idea of expanding the circle of people that visit parks or that get out into wild places? And
well, let me just speak to it from where I am right now, which is a long way from the North Cascades. Because here in New Mexico, the demographics of people who use public lands, not necessarily national parks, but even here in New Mexico, is so different than in the Pacific Northwest, because this community down here is a Native American and Hispanic community. We Anglos are in the minority. So it's different. So there's a demographic issue here too, you know, people who live near parks take advantage of them. And down here, you know, the culture is different. And I think that Saul mentioned almost all of the aspects of this challenge except the cultural one, you know, and that is that different cultures have different values. And truly, while they're all Americans, there are subcultures within the American culture that have different values and preferences and ideas about what's fun and so on and so forth. So that's another dimension of all of this. So I think it's inevitable that it'll change. And hopefully it'll change faster than it has been in the recent past in the Pacific Northwest and throughout the rest of the national park system.
Yeah, I think North Cascades Institute has actually done a good job in trying to reach out to some of these communities, but it probably could do more, even to the point of, you know, taking another hard look at the center itself, its physical plan, and is it set up to, is the whole system set up to get kids from farther away with a more multi-ethnic reach? Is there a way to persuade parents who have never heard of this thing, from Hispanics in Burlington to African Americans in Seattle to Native American communities in Northwest Washington and so on, to, yeah, let us have your kids, you know, come on up with them. We've got something set up there that they're going to be comfortable with, and so on. And it's tough to do. I mean, I would not be a good guide for it. I think it's going to take some staff coming in that's going to have new ideas about how to do that kind of outreach.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, we serve all the fifth graders in Mount Vernon, all the fifth graders in Burlington. So our youth programs, our youth leadership adventures, the high school programs are majority people of color. It just takes more. You know, we have, 92 beds at the Learning Center. Do we want to be a facility with 400 beds? When we designed the Learning Center, we said no. And we said no for many reasons, but one was we just, you know, we felt like the landscape there worked well with the numbers that we have now. Doubling, tripling, quadrupling that, you lose that, you know, you lose those vestiges of the ability to have some experience with solitude and quiet in a place like that. But that doesn't mean we don't need more organization. I don't think it necessarily means about the Institute growing much giantly bigger, but we need a lot more peer organizations all across this state doing this exact thing. I was part of a group years ago that came up with a proposal that said that by the time kids graduate from high school, they should spend a week at a residential learning center on the east side in the Shrub Steppe out in wheat country, a week in a place like North Cascades or someplace on the west side, and a week on the Olympic Peninsula. And the coast. So they really saw, just in Washington State, the diversity of land and people, and served the diversity of you know, the wide diversity and numbers of kids here. Because right now you could take all of the residential programs that do this in Washington State, of which there's probably, I'd say, half dozen, and we'd serve probably 10% of the fifth grade population in a particular program.
Yeah, that makes me think about the Outdoor Schools for All initiative that's happening in the state. Not to get tangled up in that, but promising development.
We're going to be promoting that pretty heavily at some point in the near future.
The idea behind that is that every school children would get a residential environmental education experience at some point in their schooling. And I think Oregon passed something legislation like that.
Yeah, Oregon did that through a citizens initiative and is funding it.
Yeah, well, this is a really rich vein to talk about the future of environmental education, the future of conservation, the diversity of conservation, diversifying of environmental nonprofits. All of this, again, could be a much longer Zoom chat and discussion, and you three would be great to be weighing in on that. Thank you for your brief thoughts to touch on that. And looking at the time now, I feel like I'm going to turn to some questions from our audience. I've got a few here, including, let's see, I was going to go to, this one's fairly straightforward from Abigail Smith. How often does the Ferc agreement get negotiated? And what are the implications of these negotiations for the long-term status of the Learning Center in 30 seconds or less?
The last license, it was for a 25 or 30-year license. They're talking about this current one that's going to be, the current license goes till 2025. And they're talking about the next license being for 40 or 50 years, which is saying something in the Pacific Northwest in an era of climate change, trying to figure out how you're going to mitigate for the past effects of the, so I want to be really clear about that. The license is to mitigate, the mitigation requirement is for the past impact, not the past impacts, the future impacts of what's happening. So how do you look at the future impacts of the, even knowing the future impacts of these hydro projects in an era of climate change when everything is a moving target? But that's why there's a lot of people involved.
And how do the second part was, how do the negotiations, how do you feel like they're going to impact the Learning Center specifically?
Well, the short answer is we really don't know. I have a great deal of hope and faith in the partners, all the partners who are involved with this and with City Light, because I'd say the Learning Center is one of the real success stories of the current license. Yeah. The things that we said, and the fact that everyone trusted us, when we were doing this, we were a 6-year-old organization with 5 staff. It's worked. We've had the outcomes and more that we anticipate, that we planned for. And so, and the buildings belong to the city of Seattle. They're operated by the Institute. They're in the national park, and that 3-part partnership with a lot of others are making this work. So I think I'm hopeful, but that's all to be decided. I mean, we're just in the early phases of studying what's working now and what the impacts of looking at the future are. And I'm hopeful that we will come up with something, not necessarily building something new, obviously, but making something that will serve the people who are here in this state and this country for a very, very long time.
Thanks. Our friend Bill Yake is wondering if the history and the experiences of the Institute, to your knowledge, maybe John knows this, or Saul, how has it influenced other place-based environmental education institutes around the country?
Well, Saul knows this because he's been a leader across the country in this. So Saul, take it away.
When we were designing the Learning Center, me and others visited centers all over the country and asked them what they would do differently, what they thought the trends were, what trends we thought were. And we got a lot right, and there were some things we didn't get right. But the things we got right were all about building sustainably, building flexibility into things, more multi-purpose rooms, more outdoor spaces with cover, more, things, and really taking into account the local, the place where we were. You don't build the same center in the Sierras that you would build in North Cascades, or that you would build in Tremont, where Great Smoky Mountains Institute is in North Carolina. At the same time, I think we are part of a much larger network of residential centers in Washington State, of residential centers nationally in national parks. There's 18 in national parks. And then nature centers, we're part of an organization that meets, right now, a lot of those organizations we're talking via Zoom, in one case every 2 weeks, in some cases every month, in some cases quarterly. And we're all sharing what we're doing, what we tried, with virtual programming during COVID, what worked, what didn't work. So there's a really large community out there that pays attention to what we're all doing. I mean, I can tell you what's happening at Wolf Ridge in Minnesota, and in Great Smokies, and in Nature Bridge at Olympic and Yosemite, and they can do the same. And so, teachers are great at stealing ideas. everywhere. You know, that's what they do. They think things up, they take ideas and they adapt them. And nature centers and residential learning centers do exactly the same thing. So whether it's, you know, how we buy and process food locally to feed the learning center, we've been doing that for years. That food shed approach was really kind of key when we started. That's being done in many places now. And we sometimes get all our chefs together to talk about how do you do that and how do you make that work. And we've got deep roots with the local Latinx community in the Skagit Valley, which, you know, we love it if we could get everything we need just, you know, as close as possible for both for them and for us.
I've got a question in the chat from our friend Chris Mensch. He wants to know if there's any plans for submarine tours of the submerged canyon beneath the surface of Diablo. And Saul, I'll let you follow up one-on-one with Chris and Jenny on that question. He suggests scuba, submarines, or underwater drone tours. You can follow up with him on Diablo.
I will follow up with him, yes.
Yes, please do. So I think this is a good last question. I'm sorry to not be able to get to everybody's, but we are, it's coming up on 8:30 here. So in the interest of wrapping things up, I'm going to just read this instead of trying to summarize it from Carolyn Castellum, directed to Saul. A good one to end on, I think, here. She writes, I have always noticed how you, Saul, did not let problems capsize the canoe called NCI. When I was on the board, there were many challenges, sometimes disheartening concerns, but Saul, you did not once let the canoe flip. Somehow you saw opportunity, not disaster. Your positive vision has always been remarkable. How do you do it?
Well, I'll just take the metaphor and go a little farther with it, Carolyn. Thank you for that lovely question. The canoe is designed by the indigenous people of North America to be the small canoes, the kind of canoe I'd be paddling by myself or with a small group. I'm not talking necessarily about the Salish canoes here, but actually the Salish canoes too, they were built out of local materials. They could be repaired in the field when things broke or burnt. They could be righted and bailed when they flipped, and they do flip. And they can be portaged and carried over large, long heights of land and set upright, and the journey continues. So I think we did flip. Not a lot, but I think we did flip. And I think we bailed out the boat and kept going. And because that to me is what you're talking about is being at a scale and a size where things are managed by the people at hand. And so you can do things like that. And that doesn't mean, you know, when we started, there was Tom and I, and now there's, you know, Tom's in Arizona, and there's 65 of us when we're fully out there, and it may grow. But I think the attitude is that when we were designing the Learning Center, we wanted it to be sustainable. We wanted it to be a model of green architecture and all those good things. And we got some incredible designs, and some of them had, you know, control rooms that looked like they were on a submarine. So lights would go on and the heat would go on buildings on different schedules, so that people, you know, you would save heat because things would come on as people were driving up, the rooms would be coming up to temperature and all that kind of stuff. Well, the architects we selected, HKP architects in Mount Vernon, and David Hall, who was our lead architect then, told us, sustainability means when something breaks, you can fix it. And you can fix it with the people on hand, or somebody who you can get to drive up there from the lower down in the valley, and you don't have to fly them in from, you know, I'll pick on San Diego, you know, with a new computer chip. So that was part of the approach. And I think that's kind of where it is now. You know, we're not high tech, but we are, you know, high touch. We're trying to make things work in this place. And you would do it differently in other places. But the canoe metaphor is certainly a good metaphor for me. I've traded in my ice axe a long time ago for a paddle. So anyway, I'll just thank Carolyn for that great one. I did see one question on there. I'd like to answer quickly because it was written up there really early and maybe got lost.
Sure.
Someone asked if the North Cascades Conservation Council was instrumental in creating the Institute at the beginning, I think is what they said. And no, I knew about them, but I did not know about their role I knew about the role in the parks. I didn't know about their role in getting involved with the dam relicensing at all until Dave Fluharty called John and I up and said, hey, I've got this idea we should talk about. But I'd say they were instrumental. They were the key player at the beginning, along with the Park Service, of us getting involved in the Learning Center and creating that, which then transformed North Cascades Institute. So we owe them an immeasurable debt.
Yeah, great. Good. Thanks for touching on that earlier question.
Can I just say the canoe answer is a hell of a good answer, and classic Saul Weisberg that he could come up with that. I thought that was pretty good.
It's almost like Carolyn knows how to ask.
He set him up for that, right?
Yeah, that was nice.
What can I say? No setup. Or maybe setup. Okay.
Saul, we're going to still have our closer. We're way over time, but we're still going to ask you to read a poem or two.
Wow.
To close us out, just maybe less than we anticipated, but I want to give such gratitude to the three of you, especially our special guests John and Bill, for being here tonight and giving your time up for this conversation, and even more so for being such an integral part of the Institute story. And it's what a long, strange trip it's been, as they say, and you two have made huge impacts. So it's really just wonderful to circle up this virtual Zoom campfire and hear some of your memories and some of your reflections on your time at the Institute and with the North Cascades in general. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Christian.
And you two can say goodnight. Thank you, and thanks to everyone for watching and sticking with us, going over time and asking great questions. But we cannot sign off without hearing a few poems from Executive Director of the North Cascades Institute for the last 35 years, co-founder, poet, teacher, paddler, etc. On and on and on. Saul Weisberg, please grace us with a few poems, and then Claire's going to come in to wrap things up. Thank you.
Thank you, Christian. And thank you so much, John and Bill. Okay, I will try to change this around a little bit. When I started at the North Cascades National Park, my first year, I was the backcountry ranger at Cascade Pass, and I had never been to Cascade Pass before. So I remember, walking in there, brand new ranger, probably 80 pounds on my back, a shovel in my hand, because Bill Lester, my boss, said backcountry rangers are, have to do real work too out there. It's not just the trail crew who gets to do real work. So I was pretty loaded down, and I set up my camp in Pelton Basin, and then I went up, hiked up sometime the next couple of days up Sahalee Arm from Pelton Basin, where you can look down into Boston Basin. And this poem did not completely come out of that trip, but it's called Sahalee Moraine, the moraine just below the glacier at the top of Sahalee. White remnant of glacial ice, curve of gray rock unwinds to meet the sky. A thin line of mountain hemlock follows the moraine into clouds. Above timberline, we pause between two branches of a foaming creek. Across the valley, marmots whistle, then silence. Small creeks gather at the headwaters of the Ferc. Far below, a green ridge of heather and a snowmelt stream, almost too faint to hear. Luminescent clouds rise from the valley, drift toward distant waterfalls. It feels good to walk uphill on sun-warmed rocks. All trails lead to mountains. And let me jump way ahead here. This is a poem from, it involves my good friend Tom Fleischner, who helped start the Institute way back in the day. This was, after that though, he and his family had come in and met with me, and then they'd hiked up to Heather Pass to camp with their young kids. And the next day I got off work. I got off work at 4 o'clock, and I had my gear in my car, and I drove up and started walking up the trail very late in the day, walking pretty fast, trying to get up to Heather Pass to meet them to spend the next couple of days. This is called Ascending Heather Pass. Clouds in the valley, blue on the summit, sun and shadows. Last night's rain, in the center of each leaf, a single pool of light. 3 miles and still climbing, I come upon an old woman hiking with backpack and crutches. Unsure of how to pass on the narrow trail, I walk slowly, 50 feet behind. When she stops, bends over, I kick stones. She looks up, smiles, and exclaims, "The violets are so blue." Her eyes, sparkling, are also blue. And one last, just to take this home. This is back to, this is all from my book, Headwaters, Poems and Field Notes. It's not all North Cascades, but there's definitely a lot of North Cascades in here. This poem is called Pelton Basin for Shelley, my wife at this point in time. I had known Shelley. She was a friend of friends for a long time. And I was going to see her just before she headed off to graduate school in California. And I ended up not being able to go. I was going to go see her at a friend's wedding. And there was a rescue, and I ended up having to go and look for someone. So I never was able to make it to that friend's wedding. And so I thought I wouldn't ever probably see her again. And she decided to hike in with another friend to visit Tom and I, who had been up at camping in Pelton Basin in late September at the end of the season. So this is called Pelton Basin for Shelley. Moonlight touches the ridge crest. Fresh snow dusts the peaks. Cold September stars paint the shadows of the night. In the midst of all this bright beauty, your smiling face, dancing eyes, curves of breast and belly, tasting the darkness, tasting the mountains. Gentle woman, to wake again nestled in your arms would be all I ask. To kiss the hollow of your neck, a blessing. So I think that kind of rounds it out. The North Cascades have given a lot to me, and I am grateful to these mountains and rivers and to all of you who've been along on the journey. And I've still got another month and a half to go, so it's really fun. Okay, Claire, it's all yours.
Well, I think that a lot of people in the audience who watched tonight would say that they are grateful to you too for your 35 years. Is that what it is? 35 years of service, really. And what you've given to this community, to this whole area. It's very, very, very important work. And I can't even imagine how fulfilling it must be and must have been all these years. So I want to say thank you to you and to Bill and to John and to Christian and to Kim for all participating and helping pull this together tonight. I am going to put right now the link in the chat to the page of our website where folks can, if you click through to that, it'll take you to the Village Books website where we have a list of our authors' books available tonight. So we encourage you to check that out and maybe support our programming and our bookstore and our authors, most importantly, by purchasing their books. And I want to say, I do agree with Bill. Your response with the canoe analogy, that was really something. That was very impressive. I thought, wow, did she throw him that softball? Did he know that was coming? Because that was a great answer.
What can I don't know. I just, sometimes when I say stuff like that, it does not go over so well.
Oh, well, tonight it landed. It landed very, very well. So thank you, sir. And thank you to the audience. And I think with that, we'll say goodnight. This event is recorded and it will be on our YouTube channel tomorrow. So feel free to share it with all your friends. And I think that's it. We get to say goodnight. Do you have final words, Saul?
Good night. Good night to everyone. Thanks so much for being here and for, I know we went long, but seems like, looks like a lot of people are here. So it's really fun. And there'll be more events. There's actually gonna be a virtual retirement event for me at the end of June. It'll be on our website. So people can look at that. There were some really great questions in there that I wasn't keeping track of it because I was mostly looking at the screen. But if you asked a question and you didn't get an answer, you know, email it to Christian Martin at the Institute. He has a link on our staff there, and we'll make sure that he gets an answer to you, or he talks to a bunch of us and gets answers, because I do think that there were some great questions there.
Yeah, I agree. All right. Well, thank you, and good night.
Good night, all.